Aurelien stepped closer, his gaze steady and sincere. "Selene, you deserve to live. Don't let anyone or anything make you forget that," he said, his words reaching something deep within me, something I had buried under months of guilt and exhaustion. When he reached out and touched my hand, I didn't pull away. And then, before I could process what I was doing, his lips were on mine. It wasn't planned, and I didn't think I was capable of it, but in that moment, with the softness of his lips on mine, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: life. As I pulled back, my heart pounded, wild and alive. Hello everyone, my name is Selene. 5 years ago, I stood before my family and friends, gazing deeply into Adrian's eyes, my heart overflowing with the unwavering belief that he was my forever. Back then, I had no doubt that our love could conquer anything, even though we had faced our share of challenges long before we said, "I do." Love, people say, is supposed to overcome all obstacles. I believed that with every fiber of my being. But I never imagined that love could fade, not through betrayal or the cruelty of death, but through the silent, relentless erosion of time. It crept in slowly, suffocating us little by little, until it had taken away everything we once held sacred. I still remember how my blood turned cold at the sound of the voice on the other end of the line. "Your husband's been in an accident," they said, their tone unnervingly calm. Adrian survived, physically unscathed except for a few cuts and bruises, but his mind was irreparably altered. The doctors called it anterograde amnesia. He couldn't form or retain new memories. Some days, he'd recognize me, call my name, and smile. On others, his gaze was vacant, as though I were a stranger. I fought for him, for us. I told him stories of our love, showed him our wedding photos, and tried to piece together the life we had built. But every effort was wiped away by the next morning, leaving me exhausted and empty. Over time, I ceased to be the woman Adrian had fallen in love with and became his caregiver, a shadow of who I used to be. One evening, my best friends Lena and Isabel staged an intervention. "You're drowning, Selena," Lena snapped. I argued, guilt surging through me, but Isabel gently said, "This isn't about Adrian, it's about you. You need to live." They dragged me to a downtown bar, where the dim lights and pounding music drowned out my thoughts. I felt out of place amidst the laughter, dancing, and carefree energy until I met them. Aurelien, with his piercing eyes and warm smile, made me forget the weight I carried, if only for a moment. Lucas, calm and attentive, listened to every word as if it mattered more than anything else in the world. And Victor, boisterous and full of life, pulled me out of my shell and made me laugh in a way I hadn't in years. That night, for the first time in months, I felt alive. Amidst the music and unfamiliar faces, I wasn't just existing, I was living. But as dawn broke, I knew I had to make a choice, remain trapped in the shadows of my past, or step into the uncertainty of a future that was mine to claim. The four of us found ourselves huddled in a corner of the bar, laughing and talking as the hours slipped by. For the first time since Adrian's accident, I didn't feel invisible. I wasn't Adrian's wife, or his caretaker, I was just Selene. It was Aurelien who suggested we step outside for some fresh air. "It's too loud in here," he said, his smile soft but insistent. "Come on." I hesitated, glancing at Lena and Isabel, but they were engrossed in their own conversation. "Just for a minute," Aurelien added, his voice coaxing, a quiet invitation I found impossible to refuse. We stepped out into the alley behind the bar. The city's hum surrounded us, but the thick brick walls muffled the noise of the crowd. The cool air brushed against my skin, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe, a deep, unburdened breath. Aurelien leaned casually against the wall, his gaze settling on me like he was trying to read a language only I could speak. "You haven't laughed like that in a long time, have you?" he asked, his voice calm but knowing. "No," I admitted softly, my lips curving into a faint smile that felt foreign to me. "It's been a while." He studied me for a moment, his expression gentle but piercing, like he could see through all the walls I'd built. "You're carrying a lot, Selene," he said, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. "But you're still standing." That's something incredible. I laughed, but it was more of a breath than a sound. Aurelien took a step closer, closing the space between us with an ease that felt both natural and electric. Selene, he said, his voice a low murmur that resonated in the stillness, you deserve to feel alive. Don't let anyone, or anything, make you forget that. His words hit something buried deep within me, a part one had hidden beneath months of guilt and exhaustion. When he reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against mine, I didn't pull away. The touch was soft, grounding, an anchor in the storm I didn't know I needed. And then, before I could think or react, his lips were on mine. The kiss wasn't rushed or demanding, it was tender, a quiet plea for connection. It was as though he was reminding me of something I had long forgotten, that I could still feel, still want, still be alive. When I pulled back, my heart was pounding so loudly I could hardly hear my own thoughts. I have to go, I stammered, stepping back. Selene. I can't, I said, shaking my head, my voice trembling. I turned and hurried back inside, my hands trembling as I grasped the door. The rest of the night passed in a haze. I barely spoke to Lena or Isabel, my mind racing with a tangle of emotions I couldn't untangle. When I returned home, Adrien was asleep on the couch, the soft flicker of the TV casting shadows over his face. I stood there for a long moment, staring at him. He looked so peaceful, so unchanged. But inside me, something had shifted, an undeniable mix of exhilaration and guilt, each fighting for dominance, leaving me caught in the storm. All night, that kiss consumed my thoughts. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a moment laced with thrill, excitement, and an undercurrent of unease. The kiss with Aurelien haunted me in ways I never anticipated. I replayed it over and over in my mind, the warmth of his hand on my waist, the gentle press of his lips on mine, the way his eyes saw me, truly saw me, as if I wasn't invisible. The next morning, I woke up beside Adrien. His face, soft and peaceful in sleep, betrayed no hint of the betrayal I carried. The weight of guilt settled over me like a suffocating blanket, but beneath it, there was something else, something I couldn't admit to myself. I felt alive. I told myself it was a mistake, that it would never happen again. But as the days blurred into weeks, I found my thoughts straying to Aurelien more often than they should. He texted me once, a simple, harmless message, asking how I was. When his name appeared on my phone screen, my chest tightened. I stared at the message far too long before replying, I'm fine. Hope you're doing well. But the truth was, I wasn't fine. Adrien, of course, had no idea. How could he? He was trapped in the endless loop of his broken mind, and I was trapped alongside him. I tried to push thoughts of Aurelien away, but it felt like trying to hold back a rising tide. Each time Adrien forgot an important conversation we'd had, or looked at me with that unfamiliar gaze, as if I were just another stranger in the room, I felt myself drifting further away from him. And with every inch of that distance, I found myself drawn closer to the memory of that kiss, a quiet flame that refused to be extinguished. A week later, I couldn't resist. I texted Aurelien, using a flimsy excuse about returning a lighter. When he smiled at me from a corner table at the cafe, my heart fluttered, terrifyingly alive. Our conversation felt effortless, his questions pulling pieces of me I thought I'd lost. As we stood by my car, his hand brushed mine. You don't have to go back, he said gently, his words lingering long after I drove away, guilt and longing twisting within me. Days later, Lucas's quiet world on social media drew me in. On impulse, I messaged him. His reply was kind, simple, grounding. Unlike Aurelien, Lucas didn't stir recklessness, he brought calm, a kind of solace I hadn't known I needed. The next day, I asked Lucas if he wanted to meet. I could use some fresh air, I said, suggesting a walk. We met at a quiet park on the edge of town, where the only sounds were rustling leaves and birdsong. Lucas arrived in a flannel shirt and worn sneakers, holding a thermos. Thought you might like this, he said, handing it to me. Thank you, I murmured, savoring the warmth of the tea against my palms. We walked for what felt like hours, talking about everything and nothing. Lucas had this way of making me feel seen without overwhelming me. He didn't rush to fill silences, he let them be, peaceful and unpressured. Eventually, we stopped at a bench overlooking a small lake. The setting sun painted the water in shades of gold and orange. "It's beautiful," I said, more to myself than to him. "It is," he replied softly. Then, unexpectedly, he reached out and brushed his fingers against mine. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Selene," he said hesitantly, his voice tender. "I don't want to overstep, but it feels like you need someone. Someone who understands." I didn't answer. Instead, I turned to him, and before I could think or stop myself, I leaned in and kissed him. This kiss was different from the one with Aurelien. It was gentler, slower, like testing the water instead of diving headfirst. Yet it stirred something deep inside me, a need, a longing I hadn't felt in years. When I pulled away, I saw the same mix of confusion, hope, and fear in his eyes that churned within me. "I should go," I whispered, standing abruptly. "Selene, wait," Lucas called after me, but I was already walking away, my heart pounding as I made my way back to my car. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. 2 kisses. 2 men. And a husband downstairs who didn't even remember what day it was. I had no idea what I was doing, only that I couldn't stop. The days after my kiss with Lucas were a chaotic tangle of guilt and exhilaration. I replayed the moment endlessly, the softness of his lips, the way his touch lingered, the quiet intensity in his gaze. And with every replay, I felt myself unraveling further. At home, everything with Jasper remained unchanged, distant and repetitive. Some days, he remembered who I was, other days, he didn't. Despite my efforts to focus on our marriage, the vacant look in his eyes, as if I were nothing more than a stranger, made it harder to keep pretending. Then came Victor. Unlike Aurelien or Lucas, he didn't quietly slip into my thoughts. He burst in, chaotic and unapologetic, exactly the kind of disruption I didn't realize I needed. After a few playful messages, his boldness and irresistible energy had me agreeing to meet him. At the bar, Victor radiated confidence and humor, lighting up the room with his presence. His outrageous stories, exaggerated jokes, and shameless flirting made me laugh more than I had in years. He made the world feel lighter, as if all my burdens vanished whenever he was near. When the music slowed, he extended a hand. I shook my head. "I don't dance," I protested. "You do now," he grinned mischievously, pulling me onto the dance floor. At first, I felt awkward and used to such closeness, but Victor wasn't one to let discomfort linger. He spun me, then theatrically dipped me, making me laugh so hard my sides ached. And then, something shifted. His hands rested lightly on my waist, his eyes meeting mine, no longer playful. "You're beautiful, you know that?" Victor said, his voice low and surprisingly earnest. I froze, unsure of how to respond, and before I could think, his lips were on mine. The kiss wasn't gentle like Lucas's or restrained like Aurelien's. It was bold, electrifying, filled with the reckless energy that defined Victor. When he pulled back, his smile returned, softer this time. "Is this the spark you've been looking for?" he asked. My heart raced, emotions tumbling over each other. I need to go," I stammered, stepping back. "Thank you for tonight," I said quickly, turning away and rushing out of the bar before he could say another word. A few days later, I showed up at a party Victor was hosting. I entered his sprawling loft, where music and laughter reverberated off the high ceilings, but my mind was elsewhere. Anxiety, guilt, and anticipation swirled together in my chest. Victor spotted me almost immediately, cutting through the crowd like a force of nature, drink in hand and his ever-present grin lighting up his face. "Selene," he called, pulling me into a quick hug. "You look amazing." "Seriously, everyone here is going to be jealous you showed up with me." And though the night buzzed with noise and chaos, all I could feel was the silence inside me breaking apart under the weight of choices I wasn't sure I could ignore. At Victor's party, it felt like every one of my senses was heightened to the brink. Aurelien, Victor, and Lucas each carried an irresistible pull, drawing me into their gravitational fields, leaving me breathless. I saw Aurelien first. His gaze burned through the crowd, piercing every wall I had carefully built around myself. He leaned casually against the far wall, beer in hand like an afterthought, but his eyes, they told me I belonged to him, no one else. Then came Victor, brimming with energy, his grin as bright as wildfire, lighting up the room as if the world existed solely for his amusement. He approached with an intensity that was impossible to ignore, pulling me into his orbit, making everything else blur. And finally, there was Lucas, his quiet presence like a calming tide amidst chaos. His gaze wasn't fiery or wild, but deep and tender, as though he already knew every secret I was hiding. Victor led us away from the crowd into a secluded lounge. The air was thick, charged with an unspoken tension that made my skin prickle. Aurelien sat beside me, his gaze fixed on me like I was the only thing in the room worth noticing. "You are enough," he said, his voice low and steady, a vow wrapped in velvet. Before I could respond, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine. The kiss was slow, deliberate, but the intensity behind it was staggering. He pulled me closer, as if declaring that I was his and no one else's. Victor wasn't one to wait his turn. He leaned in, his touch grazing my arm, sending shivers down my spine. When he kissed me, it wasn't gentle, it was an explosion. Everything about Victor was wild, untamed, and unrestrained. His kiss consumed me like fire, electric and overwhelming, making me forget everything else, if only for a moment. And then there was Lucas. He didn't need to say anything, his eyes spoke volumes. When he leaned down, his lips found mine with a tenderness that broke something deep inside me. His kiss wasn't a storm or a fire, it was a steady stream of warmth and understanding, flowing into me with a quiet intensity. My heart ached as I felt the depth of his emotions in every soft, deliberate movement. I was being pulled into 3 different worlds, 3 men with 3 distinct energies colliding within me. There were no boundaries left, no rules to follow, only burning moments that reminded me I was alive, I was seen, and, above all, I was deeply, undeniably desired. And then, hands roaming, lips colliding, the press of their bodies enveloping mine, it was a tempest of chaos and connection, raw and electric. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I wasn't just existing, I was burning. I shattered every boundary, obliterated every line, and I did it with reckless abandon. Aurelien's kiss consumed me, fiery and demanding, a flood of heat that left me gasping, lost in his intensity. Victor's wild energy crackled between us, his touch a storm that pulled me into his orbit, a force I was powerless to resist. And Lucas, his lips, soft and deliberate, carried a reverence that made my chest ache, as if I were something sacred, something he longed to cherish. I surrendered to all of it. I told myself I was just lost in the moment, that this wasn't who I really was. But deep down, I knew the truth, I didn't regret a single second. I couldn't. For the first time in years, I felt alive. I was seen, craved, wanted. And that desire, that raw, undeniable ache, it terrified me, because it was the one thing I'd been starving for all along. I stepped out into the early morning light as the city began to wake, the first rays of dawn spilling softly over the skyline. My body felt heavy, my mind tangled in a web of confusion, and my emotions a storm I couldn't begin to untangle. I stepped into the fragile light of dawn, the city's skyline painted with hues of gold and blush. The air was crisp, yet it did nothing to clear the suffocating fog in my mind. Each step felt like dragging weights behind me, my legs heavy with exhaustion and my heart caught in a relentless tug-of-war. When I reached home, the silence inside was deafening. Jasper lay in bed, his chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of sleep. His face, softened by dreams, held a peace that made something in me fracture. How could he rest so easily while my soul was caught in the aftermath of what I had done? I slid under the covers beside him, careful not to disturb his slumber. My eyes fixed on the ceiling, tracing imaginary patterns as the events of the night replayed with brutal clarity. My lips still tingled from kisses that weren't his, my skin alive with sensations I couldn't deny. And yet, here I was, lying next to the man who had promised me forever. The weight of guilt pressed down on my chest, but it wasn't enough to crush the flicker of something else, something dangerous. Desire. Freedom. Life. Jasper didn't stir when I finally slipped out of bed, his face still serene, as though untouched by the chaos tearing me apart. I lingered in the doorway, a lump rising in my throat as I watched him. For a fleeting moment, I wished I could step back into the woman he thought I was, the woman who hadn't crossed these lines. In the kitchen, I stared blankly at the coffee pot as it sputtered and hissed, the sound mimicking the turmoil in my head. My thoughts were relentless, replaying every moment from the night before. Aurelien's smoldering intensity, Lucas's quiet tenderness, Victor's raw, electric energy. Each of them had awakened something in me, pulling me in different directions, yet all leading to the same truth: I wasn't who I used to be. I clenched the edge of the counter, my knuckles whitening as shame clashed with a visceral yearning. I wanted to undo it, to rewind time and erase the choices that had shattered the life I knew. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I knew it wasn't entirely true. For the first time in years, I had felt alive, not just existing in Jasper's shadow, but truly, painfully alive. The woman who kissed them, who broke all her own rules, wasn't someone I recognized. She terrified me. But deep down, I realized something else: she might be the only version of me capable of uncovering who I really was. And that terrified me even more.